Life Audio.
Welcome to the Team Us podcast, where we share how grace, commitment, and cooperation can help couples live the everyday moments of marriage together. Hey everyone, we're Ted
and Ashleigh Slater. Are you and your spouse in a season of grief? When we face loss, sometimes it's hard to walk through it hand in hand. Today, we share 2 practical things we have done to navigate grief together. So, Ted, did you ever take a psychology class in college?
Of course. Probably a couple.
A couple?
It's been, so many decades. So I do not recall, other than there was likely some sort of classroom experience, some kind of professor, and psychological discussion.
Cool. Well, I did. It fulfilled one of my general ed requirements.
Sure.
And this was back when I was taking community college courses in Southern California before I transferred to the University of Hawaii.
Oh, state dropping, I see.
That's me. I'm a state dropper. Anyway, we had to do a project at the end of the semester, and I picked the stages of grief as mine. Which might seem a little odd for like an 18-year-old to pick, unless you know that my dad had worked as a hospice chaplain for years. Then you go, oh, okay, makes sense. So honestly, just like you don't remember much about your classes,
Nope.
I don't remember a lot about the project we had to do at the end that I did on the stages of grief, except that I had to create one of those like poster board presentations for it.
Sure.
And I do still remember the stages of grief.
And?
Do you know them?
I have heard them, and they made sense to me. And like if I go through something really difficult, I'll refer to them because it sort of helps me map out what the coming months and years will look like.
Okay.
But you tell me.
All right. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Oof. That does not sound like fun.
No. And they were first introduced by Swiss psychiatrist Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her 1969 book on death and dying. And grief experts, such as author David Kessler, attest to the fact that the 5 stages of grief aren't a precise science, so to speak, of exactly what we'll feel when loss happens. So we may not experience each step, and even if we do, they might not be in that prescribed order.
Okay.
But, as you just said, being aware of the stages of grief is helpful to all of us in better identifying what we might feel and recognizing those emotions when they come. And I think that we've found it helpful, too, in our marriage, to recognize it in each other when we're going through grief.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where you're going to go in the conversation, but I imagine you're going to say that sometimes one of us spends a little longer in one of the periods of grief, or maybe feels it more deeply or not as deeply.
That is exactly where I'm going.
Excellent. Good. Well, let's chat.
All right. Well, what I remember, like when your dad was diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor back, I think it was around 2015, maybe. And I know that I kind of held my breath and waited to see how you would react.
Do you remember how I reacted?
Yes. But I wondered, if you'd go through all the stages of grief, because we'd gone through other losses before where you hadn't. Like when we went through the miscarriage back in 2010, from my perspective, it seemed like your grieving process went pretty fast to acceptance.
Yeah.
But then when you lost your job a few months later, because there was a reduction in force, you were a reduction in force casualty, shall we say. I think you hit every stage of grief.
That is interesting. I wonder what it says about me that when somebody dies or is about to die, I get to acceptance a lot faster than that time I lost my job.
Yeah. Well, with the miscarriage, I think that was one of those losses that, it was early in the pregnancy. So I think it felt more real to me than maybe to you. And I think I'm going to come to this later, but you asked if I remembered how you grieved when your dad died. Yeah. I don't know that you went through all the 5 stages. I think you immediately went to, how can I help? How can I fix things? Not fix that he was, but step in and help your stepmom. What can I do to help her in this? And I think that was your way of processing
That's interesting.
the loss.
It's true.
So, I mean, I've noticed similar things about myself, like different losses have brought different responses from me, depending on like how life-changing they were. You know, sometimes I've had depression come before anger, and many times I've skipped the denial phase altogether. And then we've been going through something, it's kind of a relational loss lately, and I think I skipped bargaining. I don't even think I went there.
Are we going to spend time like exploring each of these phases?
No, we don't have time to do that. But people can go look them up.
Okay.
I mean, we could.
I'm just wondering, can you summarize what bargaining means?
Bargaining is kind of like when you're like, okay, God,
bargaining with God?
It could be.
Okay.
If I do this, then will you do that? Like, say you're going through the loss of somebody being sick. If I do this, will you please make them better?
Okay.
You know, that kind of loss. Or maybe if I, like, say miscarriage, you know, there's a lot of guilt. I think that shouldn't be there with miscarriage because, you know, as the mom, it's like, well, what could I have done better? Did I do something wrong that my baby didn't survive? You know,
and
so
one of the first things the physician said was, it's not your fault.
Right. But there could be this, okay,
you
God,
still feel that way.
If I do this next time, will you let my baby live? You know, that could be a bargaining
I gotcha.
type thing. And there's probably better examples of it, but those are the things that come to mind. Right. So whether our individual stages of grief or our spouse's stages are textbook or not, what are some ways that we can walk through them together? After a short break, we'll share some principles that have been helpful to us in navigating grief together. So today we're talking about how to navigate grief together. I'm having a hard time with the word navigate today. I don't know what it is.
Just point at me and I'll say the word.
Maybe. So I have two practical things that I think we've done, and they tie into something that you said earlier. So one is we seek to understand how each other grieves. So we kind of talked about how you and I grieve differently. And I think one thing we've learned is that our individual personalities affect how we react to loss and experience sorrow.
Yeah, I've seen that with various things we've lost.
Right. Like when we went through the miscarriage, I think I was what you might call a full immersion griever. Like I didn't shy away from the deep emotional ache of loss and how it impacted me. Like I think I just let myself intensely feel all the emotions and express them, which I also did publicly, which sometimes opened me up to hurtful words or platitudes from other people. I also kept a journal during it, and I'm not a journaler.
Oh, you did? I did not realize that.
Yeah.
Or maybe I forgot.
Yeah, I have that. I still have that, which was really helpful when I when I ended up writing my book, Braving Sorrow Together, because I could go back to it when I was writing about the miscarriage. Yeah, it was helpful. But I don't like I like to edit and revise my words before they're read. So.
Sure, of course.
I think that's why I'm not a journaler. I'm like, if someone were to pick this up and read it, would I want them to read my unedited feelings and thoughts?
Interesting. So I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis wrote A Grief Observed.
Oh, that's a great book.
And it was basically his journal after he lost his wife.
Right. And that was one of the books that I read after the miscarriage.
That's a good book.
It is a good book. Yeah. So we recommend that one.
Yes.
But during the miscarriage, as we said, you didn't seem to engage the loss as emotionally. And that's not to say you didn't experience emotions, but you didn't express them in the same way that I did.
That's correct.
Yeah. Like it seemed like your tendency was to do in response to the loss rather than feel. I mean, I don't know if you think that's accurate.
Maybe. Yeah. Maybe it just prompts me to, I mean, you know the cliche about guys, they're made aware of a problem and their first reaction is, hey, how can I fix that?
Yes.
And maybe, that kind of reaction is, I apply that to a situation where somebody else might grieve. Interesting.
Well, and I wonder too, this is just occurring to me, it's not in my notes, but, with that, I was kind of a mess. No, I was a mess, not kind of.
Right.
So you were being the strong one in the situation.
I wasn't being cold-hearted, though.
No.
Or callous or any of that stuff.
No, I think we had some conversations where you didn't always understand my need to ask questions. But like also with your stepmom, when your dad was dying and died, you could be the strong one by helping her through that.
Sure.
Yeah. But I think when spouses grieve differently, as we do, and don't allow each other to walk through grief in their own individual ways, I think it can result in conflict and further hurt. And I think there's
Sure, because you might be like, why are you not grieving as deeply as I am? Do you not care for this child we lost? Don't you care about me as the mom of, a lost baby?
Yeah, and I think there's a temptation to try to make our spouse grieve the same way that we do. And I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair for me to expect you to grieve in an identical way to me or vice versa. So I think walking through grief together requires that we try to understand how our spouse grieves and then allow them to grieve in their own way.
Absolutely.
And I think ways like, how can we learn how our spouse grieves? Observe. I think that's what we've done. Ask questions. Don't judge or expect them to fit into a mold of what we believe grief looks like. Go to counseling together. I think those are ways to figure that out.
That's interesting. I almost feel like going through that list of 5, what is it? Seasons, phases? Stages. Going through that. And, again, it may not be hard science, but it seems to reflect what people go through. It might be interesting, you and me going through that maybe during date night or something and start talking about each step and, maybe a hypothetical with a parent dying or a pet dying or a job loss or a loss of a client or something.
Or look back on how we've gone through it in previous ones.
Yeah.
And I think I heard somewhere that, I didn't look this up again before working on today's podcast, but that it can be a spiral. You can come back to some of those things. And I've seen that in myself. Like I think I might be past the anger phase and then I come back to it. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to take another short break. When we come back, we'll talk about a second practical thing we can do to navigate the stages of grief together. So we've discussed seeking to understand how our spouse grieves, and I think that's a great idea that you brought up. Go through the
stages. It may seem artificial or, really too structured, but I think it would be really helpful.
I think it's helpful because we're always going to have seasons where we may encounter a loss. And so if we can I don't know that you can really fully prepare for losses, but if we can kind of evaluate that and talk about what it could look like, that might just help us better stay united. Okay, so the second practical thing we can do to navigate grief together is we try to respect when each other grieves. So just like you and I don't necessarily respond to grief in the same way, we also don't process it at the same speed. Like I might linger in one stage longer than you, and you might stay in another phase longer than me. Like I think thinking back, I think I tend to maybe be in the depression stage longer than you do, and maybe you might be in the anger stage longer than I am. I don't know. Do you think that's accurate?
I can see that. And are you talking about the job loss?
Just in general.
In general?
Well, no, I guess the job loss, because the other ones, I don't know. I don't think it didn't seem like you went through the anger phase with your dad's death or with the miscarriage.
No.
You went to acceptance.
I tend to be a
Christian fatalist.
A Christian fatalist. That what's going to happen is going to happen. People die. It's happened before. It'll happen again. God is sovereign. And God is sovereign. It's not totally fatalist. There's a Christian influence on.
Yeah, but it's this acceptance of, well, God is sovereign. I trust him in this situation.
Yeah, yeah. That's the question that we should bring up in date night, because I don't know how to answer it right now, because it's pretty deep. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this is just, us talking about this is to share our experiences and help others start talking about it too.
And I'm thinking, if you could assume if somebody is not visibly grieving, that they're not grieving, but maybe they're just internalizing it and can't talk at all about it. I know sometimes when people are grieving, they actually look quite jovial. They're making jokes. They're sort of, maybe that's part of the denial or the absurdity of the situation. And they're just, this is a way to respond to it.
Yeah. And I will say, even though, during our miscarriage, I really grieved that openly and publicly. I have had some griefs in recent years where part of me wants to internalize it a little more because I just don't know how to deal with it, or I don't know how to process it. So, yeah. So I probably still have things I need to process. That's what we're saying here.
Of course.
So part of choosing to respect when each other grieves means allowing each other to mourn at our own individual pace. So you remember Jenny Sherdell?
Oh, yeah. She's awesome.
Yeah. She's a friend of ours who's written a book on grieving the death of a baby and also worked in various roles at hospice.
That was, do you remember the name of it? It was like Name the Baby or something?
Naming the Child,
Naming
maybe?
the Child, something
I'd
like
have
that.
to look it up. I can put it in
It's a good book. She's a good author.
Yeah, I can put it in the show notes.
Okay.
I'll find that information. But when I was writing Braving Sorrow Together, I actually asked her some stuff for the book. There's a chapter on grieving the loss of life. And one of the things that she said is, almost daily, my clients tell me that others are pushing them to get over it or move on. I always tell them that there is a time to simply be present to the reality of death. It takes time to feel it, to grieve it, to fully see how this loss has changed you. And she adds, paradoxically, studies show that those who are pushed to move on grieve longer than those who are encouraged to take the time they need. And we're talking a lot about miscarriage and your dad's death, but there are all kinds of losses that we grieve and have to navigate together.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
I mean, we mentioned job loss. Sometimes when we have moved from one house to another, or
losing relationships with friends.
Yeah, state to another. We've grieved the loss of home. I know that I have grieved after the miscarriage, panic attacks, irrational fear, kind of grieve that loss of control.
Right.
Which I think plays into all losses. All losses are a loss of control in some sense. So I just want to make sure to clarify that, we say navigating grief, we're not just talking about death.
Right. I mean, for me, one of the most recent experiences with grieving was when one of our daughters was getting ready to go off to school.
Yeah, you did not take that well.
I don't know why. I don't know why, but it was like, she was getting ready to go off to college. It was a month away, and then 2 weeks away, and then a week away. And I'm sitting at my computer just wetting the keyboard with my tears. And as it turns out, she determined it wasn't a good fit. So she's back here taking community college and doing some of this. But the grieving of losing the presence of one of my kids, oof, that was hard.
Yeah, and it was only going to be 3 hours away.
Right, it was pretty close.
Right. Yeah, so that's another grief. Well, and it would have been our first one to
leave the
nest. Right. So I think if we try to rush each other as spouses to move on too quickly, it can cause us to feel like we can't share our feelings and our grief with each other because we might feel like we'll get shut down.
Right. That's really good advice. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not talking here about someone like getting stuck in a place of grief that's no longer healthy. When that happens, I think we definitely should encourage each other to get professional help and to figure out how to keep moving forward.
Right. I mean, some of the feelings could start being, the word injurious came to mind. That's a clumsy word. I'm so sorry. But like if you're stuck in like an anger phase, it can start just chewing up your soul and just making you not healthy. And so you may need help through some of these things.
Yeah. Because that affects not just your emotional health, but your mental health, your physical health.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So to recap, what are 2 practical things you can do to navigate grief together? 1, seek to understand how each other grieves. 2, try to respect when each other grieves. After this break, we'll be back with this week's Us Time Challenge. All right, Ted, for this week's Us Time Challenge.
Yes.
I think those listening should think about how they grieve and consider how their spouse does. Maybe they should talk through the stages of grief like
I think that's
we're planning
great.
to.
I think that's great.
And just talk about some ways you can better understand and respect the way your spouse experiences grief.
Sure. I mean, you could start by taking that list of 5 stages and ask each other, does this seem accurate? Have you ever gone through these phases in this order? Spent longer in one, season than another? I think it's a fascinating conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's fascinating that we realized as we were talking through this that it also kind of depends on what the loss is in how we experience the stages and which ones we go through.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it feels a little shallow for me to be like more accepting of death and less accepting of job loss.
Maybe because, I mean, God,
my identity.
Well, death was not something God intended when he first created the world. So, but it is an expected part of our world.
It is now.
Since the fall. Yeah. Whereas, so you can't do anything about death.
No.
But when it comes to losing a job, I think maybe there's a sense of, could I have done something about it? What can I do to fix it? And you can't fix it. I don't know. Now I'm just psychoanalyzing you. So,
well, we'll continue this over dinner.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us on the Team Us podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, and we'd love to have you leave a review over at Apple Podcasts. We're looking forward to next time as we keep talking about how grace, commitment, and cooperation can help couples live the everyday moments of marriage together.
Team Us with Ted and Ashleigh Slater is a production of Life Audio and Salem Media. If you liked what you heard today, please take a second to rate and review the podcast in your favorite podcast app so that more listeners like you can find the show. For more faith-filled, inspirational podcasts, visit us at lifeaudio.com.